All right, good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Bava Basra Daf Tes. This is one of the most iconic dapim in Shas because, as you can see, looking on Daf Tes Amud Aleph, about 15 lines into Rashi, it says Ad Kan Pirush Rashi Zichronot Tzadik Levracha Mikan Ve'elach Pirush Rabbeinu Shmuel ben Reb Meir, which is, of course, the Rashbam and is his grandson. So there is some conversation here about what the actual text is. And if you look in the Hagos V'Tzionim here, it doesn't say Ad Kan Pirush Rashi. It says Kan Meis Rashi Zal, much more explicit as to what actually happened. And it seems to be that he was in the middle of writing his Perush and he died. And if you take a look at the last Rashi before he dies, Alama Amar Rav Nachman, and then Rashi starts to come on Bishmaitin, and you look at the next one by the Rashbam, Alama Amar Rav Nachman Lekaman Bishmaitin, he seems to literally pick up with the pen right where Rashi left off. And historically speaking, this puts the obviously Rashi lived in the late 1100s in France, and the Rashbam took over again, a grandson. So just a lot happened here. And then even if you just flip through, just quickly looking, you'll see that the writing of the Rashbam, by and large, is way more voluminous than the writing of Rashi, probably in a 10-to-1 ratio in certain cases. Maybe the average is 5-to-1. I don't know. I've never looked. So it's an iconic daf for us to hold on to remember that Rashi died here in this parak. And today we're going to start 4 lines from the bottom. We've been discussing this idea that a squatter can make an acquisition of a property by having 3 years of being in that property without any or without any complaints from the original owners. We have laws like this today, and I know that there have actually been some cases that made the news recently of people who were squatting or people who should have been evicted who never left, which is the same thing as squatting. And it's made the news of recent. And here we're going to speak in halachic terms, of course. Yesterday, we learned that the Mari Makom for 3 years within the world of Rabbi Shmuel was the same as the world of Chazaka by Shor Hamuat, Shor Tam and Shor Muat. But the Gemara says, 4 lines from the bottom, the Rabbanon Mai, according to the rabbis, what is the Mari Makom that they hold is the source for 3 years? And the Gemara is going to present 4 different answers to this question, and we'll accept the 4th. Here's the first one. Amar Rav Yosef Kruxi. We have a pasuk. This is a pasuk from Sefer Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Beis. The pasuk says, "Sados pakesef yiknu v'chasov b'sefer v'chasom." That you should buy fields with silver, and then you should write them down. Shaharei Navi Omed be'eser. Yirmiyah the Navi was giving his nevuah, his prophecies, in the 10th year of the reign of Tzidkiyahu. Umasir al achas esrei, and he knew benevuah that in the 11th year, that was when Nebuchadnezzar was going to show up and wreak havoc. So he was giving fair warning that if he knew about the 10th and the 11th, so these, when you do the math, all the preparing was going to be 3 years of prep. So that's what the Rishonim over here explain, along Rashi at the bottom. And Amar le Abaye lav dafka. Perhaps what was going on over here in Yirmiyah Lamed Beis was not that Yirmiyahu was teaching us a din of 3 years. Amar le Abaye dilma hasam eitza tova kamashmalan. Just saying, listen, when things are going to be difficult with Nebuchadnezzar, we want to make sure that our property documents are clear. Put them in an earthenware container. Make sure they're airtight, b'chule, and maybe that's all that was happening. And says the Gemara on the top of Chav Testament Aleph, if you don't say that Yirmiyah, if you don't say that Yirmiyah was just giving Eitzah Tova, then it's difficult to understand another pasuk in Sefer Yirmiyah, which was numerous prakim earlier in Yirmiyah Lamed Tes, which was actually 10 years earlier historically, where he said, Banu batim v'shavu v'nitu ganos v'achlu es piryan, where he told them also to do some preparatory work in regards to their fields. Ma'ika amar, Ella, just like over there, in Yirmiyahu Chavtes Eitzah Tova Kamash Malon, Hachanami Eitzah Tova Kamash Malon. The Gemara rejects this first possibility. We wanted to learn from the story of Yirmiyah that the Rabbanon hold that a chazak of 3 years is learned from the pasuk in Yirmiyah Lamed Beis. The Gemara says it from Yirmiyah Lamed Chavtes. We know that that's not true. Teda, the Gemara gives another raya. Teda almost always means that we're going to bring another proof. Here's another proof that these are preparatory words, and this is also in Yirmiyah Lamed Beis. So what we're doing is connecting the first pasuk that we presented of Sados Bekesev Yiknu with this new pasuk 4 lines down, V'nasatem Mekli Cheres L'man Ya'amdu Yamim Rabim, which is clearly a language of preparation. Sign them, put them into an earthenware vessel so that they last a long time. That's not halachic jargon. That's just keep your stuff in a locked box, in a fireproof box, just in case something happens. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'hakol nikyeh b'dvaro. Ella, how then do we know that the Rabbanan hold? I should say, what is the source for the rabbis that a chazaka is 3 years, that a squatter's rule will apply after 3 years? Elama Rava Shata Kamaisa. When it comes to the first year, if you're squatting on my property, if I own a lot of residential real estate, and I see that in one of my backyards, one guy's sitting there, then machil inish, no, nebach. I feel bad for the guy I'm going to be mocha. Tarte also machil. 2 years, I'm a nice guy. My heart goes out to him. I'm going to be a nice guy. But tlas lo machil. So the Gemara says this is how we know that 3 years is the measure, because once we get into the 3rd year, the person's not going to want to be mochel anymore. Amar le Abaye to Rava, he says, no dice. Elameata, if that's true, what you're saying is that in years 1 and 2, the owner is going to be totally mochel on the squatter sitting in his property, then kihadra ara, then in the 3rd year, or when we get close to the 3rd year, when the owner is going to complain and take his field back, because as we said, tlas lo machil, then what should happen is tehadar levar mipere. Then we should have said that whatever was taken during the first 2 years should be given back as the principal alone, but the squatter should have to pay none of the fruits. That's what we would have said, because according to Rava's answer, our second answer on our question, is that shata kamaisa machil inish and tarte machil, because you're machil in both years, there's no reason to pay the peros. Alama, why do we have a din of Amar Rav Nachman hadra ara v'hadra peir, that you have to pay back both? Well, it can't be that Rava is right, because if Rava says that it's all about mechila, then mechila means you're never going to be chayav again. So if we say like the original language of Rava, that it's shata kamaisa machil inish, and shata and then tarte is also machil, then when you're makbid on me that I should give back your property, I wouldn't have to give you back the fruits, and that's a steer to Rav Nachman, which isn't possible. So therefore, the Gemara says for the 3rd answer, Ela Amar Rava shata kamaisa lo kapid inish. I'm not makbid that you live in my property. I'm not being mochel on you. I'm just not makbid that you're living in my property. I am makbid on you eating my fruit. I'm not makbid on you living in my property. And tarte lo kapid, the 2nd year also, I'm going to be a nice guy. You can be in my property. You just can't eat my food. But tlas kapid. So then the Gemara pushes on this and says, well, if it's all about kpeda, if it's only about how strict we are, so then the following might be true. Amar le Abaye, Elameata, Kagon Hani Debei Bar El Yashiv. These people, that was their name. It was the home of Bar El Yashiv. Tekapte, they were so strict about people being on their property that Afilu Aman Dechalef Amitzra Didhu, Hachanami de la Alter Have Chazaka. If all that you're saying, Rava, in this 3rd answer, is that it's not about Mechila, but it's about Kpeda, about how strict you are, so then I should assume that it's Bikpeda Talia Milsa. It's all dependent on how strict you are. And therefore, if I'm super strict and then you just simply cross my border for a short period of time, maybe that's a chazaka. And if you want to say that that's true, imkain nasata devarecha l'shiurin. If that's true, this is something we've seen in Shas a good number of times. You've created a rule that is super subjective, meaning if it's only bikpeda talia milsa, I don't like when people walk on my grass. I just don't like it. Other people don't mind at all. And you can tell because their grass looks like garbage. You could tell. People who care. People who don't. But if we have it be that there's a subjectivity to what is considered squatting, then we then don't have a rule of consistent application where we can say, here's the rule of thumb. No, it's completely subjective at that point. The svara in halacha of im kein nasata devarecha l'shiur is a rejection. What we're saying is that you can't have it be that this is the policy, that it's only based on kpeda. Because if it is, then as many people as there are in the world, you'll have gradations of being makbid on walking on your property. Some people will shoot you with a gun when you walk on their property. Some people will let you take their car without asking. So that can't be. Elo, here's our 4th answer. 1/3 of the way down on Chav Tes Amud Aleph. In the first year, the squatter is going to be careful to hold on to any documentation. Tarte vitzlas mizdaher. Second and third years also. Tvei lo mizdaher. And we have this as a halacha, that in halacha, we don't require someone to hold on to their document of ownership of a property more than 3 years. 3 years is the maximum. You want to make a claim to me after I've been living there for 5 years? There's no obligation for me to produce documentation. At that point, hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. You'll have to bring a proof to get me off of the property. But in the meantime, once we hit 3 years, we are all done. And because of this halacha of 3 years, let's just go back to where we started because we've given our fourth answer. We want to know, according to the Rabbanon, how they learn out this idea that 3 years is a chazakah. The Gemara responds by saying this answer, that it's from the rule of how long the Bailim have to hold on the shtar to make sure that the world knows that they own the property. Amar le Abaye, Abaye says, Elameata, if that's true, then macha shelo befanav lo tehave macha. If it's true what you're saying, that we are learning this from the world of documents, then we should have a rule that if the macha is not done in the presence of the squatter, then it doesn't count as a protest. To Amar Le, what could the argument be? Imachis ba'apoy, the squatter could say, look, with Mr. Baal, had you been standing in front of me, hava mizdaharna bishtaroi, I would have been more careful to hold on to my documents. But you didn't show up in year 1, 2, and 3. Now you can't show up after the time lapse of 3 years and ask me to present documentation. I'm only halachically required to hold on to documentation for 3 years. So says the Gemara, that's not a good svara, because the Amar Le, what could I argue if I was the Baal? I could argue chavrach isle, the chavrach isle. So says the Gemara, just like we saw yesterday in the camp of Rabbi Shmuel when we were discussing his rules. Here we say the same thing by the Rabbanon, that really it shouldn't be the case that the Bailim have to be physically present when they make a claim against the squatter. It should even be the case that they can do so from afar, because when I'm makbid on something, word gets around. If you could imagine, like in the current climate, right? Yeah, if you have a significant American politician who makes a comment about the Israel-Gaza war, Netanyahu is going to find out. He's going to find out. It doesn't matter what happens, someone's going to tell him, because chavra islay. Word travels. That's what the Gemara says. Amar Rav Huna, a new din, halfway down on Chav Tes Amud Aleph, connected, of course. Shalosh shanim she'amru hu she'achlan ritzufos. When we talk about the 3-year measure, that's only under the assumption that it's ritzufos, that it is there with consistency. Namely, seemingly, you can't even miss a day. 3 times 365 is exactly the number of days that you need to be there to be a functional squatter, to be able to get that property in the end. The Gemara says, well, that's not a chiddush. My kamash malan. Tanina, we already learned this. Chez kasan shalosh shana miyom liyom. We saw this in our Mishnah at the open of the parak yesterday on Kav Ches Amud Aleph. And what have you just taught me? You're teaching me now, Rav Huna, the Amora. You're teaching me something that's expressly written in a Mishnah. We already have the din miyom liyom. What are you adding? Says the Gemara, maybe I do 12 months now, skip a couple months, 12 months, and then skip a couple months, and then 12 months. So on the one hand, I did the 3 times 365. However, I didn't do them ritzufos. That's where Rav Huna is coming in. That it means that I could include breaks, says the Gemara, and but maybe it's okay if the 3 sets of 12 months are spread out over many years. Kamash malan, that Rav Huna is correct. That Rav Huna is saying that they have to be ritzufos. And in the reish of our Mishnah, in the first half of our Mishnah, when we're discussing the case where it says 3 years miyom liyom, it has to mamish be a consistent set of days, 3 times 365 without breaks. Amar Rav Chama, umodi Rav Huna be'asre de muvre bagi. Rav Huna, who said this rule that it has to be sha'achlan ritzufos, that you were consuming food there for 3 years straight, he says, I don't have the rule of ritzufos if it's the typical standard in that community, that it's the muvre bagi, that we alternate years. because then nobody would ever have that. Then the squatter rule changes. If the standard is that people skip years, then even Rav Huna would agree. Says the Gemara Pshita, that should be pretty obvious, because squatter over there means 3 years, but staggered. Says the Gemara, Lo Tzricha. What is the chiddush of this idea of the Muvrei Bagi? The Ika de Muvrei, the Ika de Lo Muvar. Someone in that community alternates using their property, and some don't. The Haigavra Muvra, and this guy was Muvra. And even here, Reb Chama says that Rav Huna would agree that you can still establish a chazaka of 3 years, even if a person takes off a year, as long as there's somewhat of a standard that people take a break during those 3 years. Mahu detema amar le im isa dididach havoy iboy lach lemizra. Maybe we would have argued that the Bailim would have said to the squatter, well, Mr. Squatter, you're all clever, but if this was really yours, why didn't you plant it this year? Kamash Malan, that the Amar Le, the squatter can say back to him, Chada Ara Bekula Baga Lomatzina Lintar. It's not financially worthwhile to me to do that, to get guards just for the guards to watch my one field. I'd rather divide the cost of guards watching me in the fields of 10 neighbors. That's much cheaper for me. So there's no way that I'm going to do that. It doesn't make any sense for me to do that. Or I prefer to alternate years while I'm squatting, because let the ground lay fallow and let the nutrients regrow. And then when I plant corn the next season, okay, they're going to grow so much better. So that's what the Gemara says over here about this din of Rav Huna, that yes, we need ritzufos. We need the 365 times 3 to be in a row, unless it's customary in that community that people specifically don't squat for 3 years straight. Last of the short lines on Chav Tesamid Aleph, Tanan, we have a Mishnah. Chezkas habatim. That's how we opened up our parak on the previous block. The habatim, there's a problem, because when it comes to homes, to be a mama yade, people can see you coming in and out of your house when you're there during the day. But Belelia lo yade, this was before rain cameras. Nobody knew that you were at home at night or not home at night. No one knew. Amar Abaye, man masid abatim. That's not true. Abaye says, we all have that neighbor who always knows what's going on in your house. We have them. So who's the one who's going to watch over the homes? Shivave. Oh, it's going to be the neighbor. It's going to be the neighbor who does nothing but sit on her porch and watch people go in and out of their house and be a yenta. And Shivave made a yada to be a mama uvalelia. The neighbors know, oh, I know the Kareshes are home. I recognize his car. I saw the lights turn off. I saw him come home. So therefore, neighbors, says Abaye, make for wonderful witnesses as it relates to a squatter being in the house during the day and during the night. Rava Amar, a clever answer. Rava Amar, no. Kigon de asu beitre, there were witnesses, the Amre, and what did the two witnesses say? Anan agrinan mine. We rented the house from the squatter. This guy's got an awesome Airbnb plot twist. He stole someone's house, he's squatting in it, and now he's renting it out on Airbnb. So the people who lived in the house gave their own testimony about themselves. We lived in the house. The Darinan Beitz last Shinin Biamama Uvalelia. We say about ourselves, we lived in that house for 3 years, day and night. We didn't skip a night, no vacations. Amar le Rav Yemar le Rav Ashi. Well, their testimony should be nogea b'davar. Hani nogin be'edusan hein. The principle of being nogea be'edusan is that their opinion is tainted. They have skin in the game. Why? If they don't say that, then Amrina and Lahu, the Bezdin, could say to them, Zilu havule agar beisalahai. No, you paid the wrong person rent, because really the squatter doesn't own it. Now you have to pay another rent, double rent this month. You have to pay it to the original owners because you paid it to the wrong person. Amar le Rav Ashi says back to Rav Yemar, that is amateur hour. He says, Daine de shvile hachi daine. That psak that you just gave, that's only for whatever Division 1, it's for the minor leagues, because after all, milo askinan, aren't we talking about a case? Says Rav Ashi, kigon denikite agar besa. He's holding the rent in his hand, ve'amre, and saying leman leisve. These are the Eidim who are the ones who rented from the squatter. They haven't paid yet because they're not 100% sure what to do with that month's rent. So the Gemara says that they're holding the rent in their hand, and therefore they're not nogea b'davar. They don't care who they pay the rent to. They just want to live in that place. So they haven't spent any money yet. Amar Marzutra, v'itayin ve'amar, If there is a claim that says le sutre sade le ashude le the dar beit slash shnei b'yamama uvalelia ta'ano se ta'ana, that if in fact we are making a claim, if there is a claim that says you need to bring two witnesses that they were there for all day and all night, that's considered to be a very valid claim. You're allowed to ask of that. And then Abaye or Rava, whatever the answer is, either we can ask the neighbors or we can ask the renters, but tachlis, that's what we need to do. We need to verify that somebody actually lived in the house day and night. That brings us to the top of Chaf Tes and Beis. We're going to be going until about 6 or 7 lines from the bottom of the page where it says Hahuda Amar. So let us continue on the top of this page. Umodi Marzutra agreed berochlen hamachzirin be'ayaros da'afal gav de lotan ta'aninan le'anan. We're going to make a claim for him that if the original owner of that house was a rochel, he was a perfume peddler, and he had to travel city to city to sell his perfumes and lotions and potions. So the Bezdin will say, look, that's Phil's job. We understand he's out of town, but Lamaisa, we're going to ask just to verify. Yo, if you're a squatter and you're on Phil's property, you need to be able to prove that you've been there every single night. Otherwise, I want my house back. But because I'm a traveler, Bezdin will say on my behalf, they'll try to verify that this was in fact the case. And if what the squatting was done in a store, then we don't even have to worry about nights because people only work the stores during the day. The Gemara tells a little bit of a story about Chazaka, 4 lines down on Chav Testament base. Rami Bar Chama v'Rav Ukva Bar Chama, these were brothers. Zavon Hahi Amsa behade hadade. They decided they were going to buy a maidservant. And here's what they did to protect each other. We didn't want it to have it be that the brothers of Rami Bar Chama and Rav Ukva Bar Chama would have any machlokas. So here's what they did. Mar ishtamesh ba rishona shlishis v'chamishis. Staggered. He took all the odd years, 1, 3, and 5. No chazaka can be made that way because he did 1, 3, and 5. Umar and his brother would utilize her. Ishtamesh ba, he would use the maidservant in shnei revi'is v'shishis. Okay. And then nafak ir or ilava. And then, after 6 years, the original owner said, you guys stole my maidservant, or you bought this maidservant from someone who wasn't allowed to sell it, but Lemaisa, she's not your maidservant. She's my maidservant. So they didn't know what to do, because on the one hand, they had the maidservant for 6 years. However, neither one of them actually had a chazak of 3 years, because they staggered the years with one brother taking the odd years, and one brother taking the even years. So also the comment to Rava, they went to Bez, and they asked the Shaila to Rava, Amar lahu, my taima avdisu hachi. Why did you brothers decide to alternate years with one brother doing the odd years with the maidservant and the other one working her during the even years? So that neither of you would have a chazaka against one another. Well, says Rava, he just extends the idea. Just like if the maidservant is by one person for years 1, 3, and 5, and another for 2, 4, and 6, just like between the brothers, there is no chazaka. Then there's also no chazaka from the original owner, even though it's been 6 years, which is a fascinating idea. Even though 6 years have transpired. But because the ownership of the maidservant during those years were alternating between people every other year, they have to therefore give the amsa back. They have to give the maidservant back to the original owner. But below amran, there is a qualification here. When would we not have to give back the maidservant? Below amran elo de lo cost of itra. That's only true if there was no documentation. That's what Rashi says. It's a shtar chaluka. Rashi says about a little, almost halfway down. Tibur maschal itra. Shtar chaluka. It's a document that indicates our split of how we're going to use this maidservant. Uve'edim shetavo lazeh shana v'lazeh shana. The document clarifies exactly what's going on. Aval kasav itra kala isle. If in fact there was a document, then there's a call about those documents, and people will hear that me and my brother, we had this maidservant, and we alternated years, and therefore, because there's a call, therefore the 3 years do create a chazaka. Amar Rava, achla kula chutz mi beis Rava. Let's say that I'm the squatter, and I'm benefiting from your entire field with the exception of one small section that is a beis Rava, a quarter of a field. So the halacha is, kana kula chutz mi beis Rava. Then I, the squatter, if I make it through my 3 times 365 days, then the halacha is that I am able to be kona all the land that I worked, but chutz mi beis Rova, but I don't get the part of the field that I didn't work. And Amar Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua below Amran, when is this true? Ela de bar zriyahi. That's only true if this corner of the field that I didn't use was fertile and plantable. Aval la bar zriyahi, let's say that it wasn't a fertile piece of property, it was all rock and I couldn't grow anything there, then it's clear why I didn't use it, but it also changes the outcome, which is that kanile agavara. If I'm working your whole property, but there's a small little cutout of your property that I didn't use. So if it was plantable and I didn't use it, then my squatting in the other parts of the property do not give me rights to this cutout, to this base rova. But if it's not plantable at all, then halacha l'maisa, my squatting, even though I never stepped foot in that section of your yard, we say that it now belongs to the squatter because it wasn't plantable anyway. Says the Gemara, Maskif lo Rabbi bar Abaye, Elameata tzunma b'ma yikne. Well, what was he supposed to do? If the corner of the field that the squatter didn't use was made of a piece of sheet metal or rock, and there's no way for him to plant, what did you want him to do to be koneh? What does that even mean? Ella, it must be ba'okume ba'chiyusa. Maybe you put animals there, or umishtacha ba'pere. Or what you did is you laid out fruit. So hachanami ibayle le'okume b'chiyusa. The same thing should be true in this case. If there's a piece of property and I was a squatter for most of it, but there's a section that I wasn't using, I should have put animals there. Inami mishtacha ba'pere. So this is a pushback of Rabbi bar Abaye to say, I disagree with you. Rava had this din that you're only gonna not acquire the base rova if it was plantable, but if it's not plantable, then you do it. No. Do a Maisa Kinyan in that space. And if you don't do a Maisa Kinyan in that space, you're not gonna own anything. So let's just review this last case and then we're gonna stop right here. Let's say you have a field with 4 quadrants. I ate food out of 3 out of the 4 quadrants over the 3 years. Let's say it's been 3.5 years and I didn't miss a day. One of the quadrants I never used. So what Rava wanted to say is that if it was plantable and you didn't use it, you showed your disinterest and your squatting doesn't help you to gain that property. However, if it wasn't plantable, Rava holds that it is automatically included. We know why you didn't use it. It's not because you didn't want the property, but it wasn't plantable. And then Rabbi bar Abaye says, that's not true. You should have done something. You should have put animals in that part of the property, in that last quadrant. Or you should have laid out some figs to dry to show your ownership. So we end with a machlokas amoraim there. We'll stop with Hahuda Amarle, 6 or 7 lines from the bottom of Chavtes Base. We'll pick up tomorrow Mirza Hashem with a blot and a half of Daf Lamed and Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph. Is that right? Yes. And then we'll be on to Shabbos. Wishing you all a beautiful night.